we had the trilateral talks with the participation of the Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Mr. Dmitry Kuleba. This meeting took place on the suggestion of the Turkish side after President Erdogan talked to President Putin. So they had this initiative. We agreed to this proposal from our Turkish counterparts because we stand for any contacts regarding the issues that are the foundation of the current Ukrainian crisis, and also we want to look for ways of how to resolve this crisis. But what we said right away, these contacts should be mutual, and they are not to be used, first of all, by our Ukrainian counterparts who do these things regularly to replace or to undermine the real, actual negotiating track that takes place in Belarus, and it is developing. So there are two delegations that were approved by the presidents of Russia and Belarus. Today's conversation confirmed that this conflict has no alternative. We talked on the initiative of our Turkish friends about humanitarian matters, and we explained what measures are taken by our military on the ground to facilitate, to help the civilians who were basically taken hostage and used as hostages by the so-called volunteer battalions and territorial defense forces. So they are used as human shields, and you are well aware of these facts. Several times a day, our officials, including from the Defense Ministry, make statements in this regard for the media, and we have reiterated then the initiative made by the Russian side some time ago on the daily humanitarian corridors. It's still in force. It's still on the table. The routes of such corridors, the schedule of these corridors are defined by those who control the situation on the ground. After they analyze the situation, and after they make sure which routes are the most efficient and the safest for the civilians to follow. And of course, we reminded our counterparts that during the latest round of talks in Belarus, the Russian side came up with the draft legal document proposals, and the Ukrainian side, when they got these proposals to work on them in Kiev, they assured us that in the near future they will give us the concrete answer, because we want to talk seriously. In Belarus, we don't want to have some formal agreements on paper. We want to agree on things that need to be resolved in the context of the comprehensive resolving of this crisis, in the context of providing security in Europe, keeping in mind, obviously, the interests of everyone with no exclusions. So if briefly, that's what we talked about. So now I'm ready to take your questions. Channel 1, Russia. Channel 1. Do we have you here with us? 1 second, please. Okay, Anadolu, if I'm not mistaken. So let's give the floor to the Turkish side. I'm not sure I got it, but I guess the question was about how the special military operation is unfolding. This assessment is given by the representatives of our defense ministry, and mainly the president. He is the commander-in-chief, and a number of times he underscored that everything is going according to plan. As for the weapon supplies to Ukraine from abroad, yes, we see how dangerous are actions of our Western counterparts, including European Union, that violated all their principles and so-called values. They encourage supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine, including thousands of the mobile air defense complexes that can be moved anywhere. And quite often terrorists use such weapons to create threats for the civilian aircraft. And in what hands these thousands of air defense units will be, we will ask our counterparts from European Union when they ask how we can put an end to the policies that have been created for years, this threat, Ukrainian threat for the Russian Federation, but we got no answer to that, how they will control these weapons after. So for the years to come, we are going to have these risks, this threat, and not only in Ukraine. They can crawl across the entire Europe, spread to entire Europe. And if we plan to attack other countries, we do not plan to attack any other countries. We didn't attack Ukraine. We just explained a lot of times that the situation has come when there was a direct threat to the safety and security of the Russian Federation. And after many years of our calls and appeals and urges to talk, no one heard us. And President Putin talked about it a lot of times. And the new facts that we see now at the territories that we liberate, in particular in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, they show that offensive actions against these republics were planned thoroughly, and it was planned to be carried out this very month. And outrageous facts about what Pentagon has been doing in the biological laboratories funded by the United States. They use Ukrainian territory to experiment on pathogens that subsequently could be used to create biological weapon. And the fact that Washington officials said they are not doing anything illegal on Ukraine comes as no surprise. And the European Union right away, they started saying in unison that European Union has no information that the Americans were perpetrating some illegal scientific researching activity in Ukraine also comes as no surprise. And the representative of the UN saying that they have no such information also comes as no surprise, because the Americans did this in secret, in deep secret, same like they work in other post-Soviet states, creating their military biological laboratories along the border of the Russian Federation and the Chinese People's Republic. And they can't say that they don't do this. There is a convention on prohibition of biological and toxic weapons, and the state has to report about any activities that they perpetrate outside their territory and inside their territory. And if I got your question right, that would be my answer. But those who flood Ukraine with weapons, they have to understand that they are responsible for what they are doing. Same like those who encourage sending mercenaries to Ukraine to wage war in these ultra-radical traditions. Those ultra-radical battalions are now introducing into the everyday life there. Thank you so much. As for the maternity word, we heard a lot of these shouts about the so-called atrocities perpetrated by the Russian armed forces on March 7th, 3 days ago. March 7th or March 6th, I don't remember exactly, but during the Security Council of the UN meeting, our delegation presented facts that this maternity word has been long captured by the Azov battalion and by other radical militants, and they kicked away all the pregnant women, all the nurses, all the medical professionals. So that was the base of the ultra-radical Azov battalion. We presented these facts 3 days ago, so you can draw your own conclusions how the public opinions is manipulated all around the world. And we can see it in the news stories of your channel and of other media outlets. So they are talking very emotionally about it, but unfortunately, the second side of any situation, the second part of any situation, the second perspective that allows you to get an unbiased view, it doesn't draw any attention, basically. As for the state of economy in the Russian Federation, we can take care of this ourselves. Our president is in charge of that. Our government is taking care of that. But once again, we saw you're saying that we used a lot of words to justify what we're doing in Ukraine. You know, we tried to draw attention to the fact that the Ukraine is turned into anti-Russia for years. And when the West publicly, openly, starting from the 2000, demanded from the Ukrainian before the election to make up their minds, who are they with, Russia or the West? So either you're with us or against us. What kind of values are these? What kind of Western values are these that were imposed on the Ukrainian citizens? More than that, we also witnessed some manipulations that the so-called pro-Western candidate, when they were the last in polls, like it was in 2009, when in violation of Ukrainian constitution, the West made Constitutional Court of Ukraine to make an anti-constitutional decision to have the third round of elections. And these kind of manipulations in those years, better years, we had plethora of them. No one has threatened anyone back then, but constantly Ukraine was turned into pro-Western experimental instrument, a tool. And eventually, when NATO started demanding Ukraine to have absolute freedom to join the bloc, when in Ukraine they started opening naval bases, military bases, when they started talking about deploying missiles that present a direct threat to the Russian Federation. We have just said about the military biological laboratories that operated in secret, that were hidden from the public opinion. And when they started talking about the necessity to withdraw from their non-nuclear status, that was then we started to ask our Western counterparts to use common sense and to agree on the principles of the security on the European continent. And we were told we can talk about anything you like, but the questions of NATO enlargement, that's a non-starter. We will decide it by ourselves without you, because the NATO enlargement does not pose a threat to you. But how come that the matters of our security, the interests of our security, are defined by NATO when they say that nothing threatens us? That's no way to go to work. You can't talk to Russia like that. So we are not interested in justifying our actions in Ukraine in any way. These actions were presented absolutely clear. We do not want to see Ukraine getting militarized in NATO or without NATO. Even without NATO, they can get military weapons that will be aimed at our territory. We do not want to see this trend going on building a neo-Nazi state in Ukraine with the neo-Nazi traditions when battalions with SS insignias are marching with the honorary guard of the president looking on. And there are a lot of facts like that when they are basically performing terrorist activities. We want Ukraine to stay neutral. President Putin said that on many occasions, that insisting on non-enlargement of NATO, we do not want to deprive Ukrainian people and Ukrainian state of their security. We're ready to talk about security guarantees for the Ukrainian state, along with the security guarantees for the European state, and of course, for the security of Russia. And judging from what President Zelensky is saying, he's starting to understand this approach. Well, it makes us cautiously optimistic. And as for our economic problems, we will deal with that. We will handle that. We handled a lot of difficulties throughout our Russian history because we had a lot of difficult times. But this time, I assure you, we will get out of this crisis with a healthier mentality, with a healthier conscience, because we would not have any illusions that the West is a reliable partner. We won't have any illusions when the West speaks about their values, they believe that these values exist. And we won't have illusions that we will be betrayed at any time by anyone, and their own values will be betrayed. Where did you see that the private property was basically trampled upon? Where did you see that the presumption of innocence as the staple of the legal system in the West was basically ignored and blatantly violated? So we will manage, we will handle that, I assure you, and we will do everything we can not to depend on the West anymore in these areas of our lives that are vital, that are essential for our people. Now, Channel 1. Channel 1, if you could use the mic, please. Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Channel 1, I would like to quote one of the latest Kyiv statements. The deputy head of the administration said that we are ready for the diplomatic talks, but the only serious negotiations that can be held with Russians only possible on the levels of presidents. So do you think it is reasonable to have the presidential talks in the near future or at some time? I think everyone knows well that President Putin never refuses to speak, to talk, but we do not want to have talks for the sake of having talks. We want to talk about to reach certain agreements. And we also talked about that today with Mr. Kuleba, because he mentioned the topic that he have just quoted, and I reminded him that we always stood for talking, for meeting, if we really can get some added value and if we can resolve the matter. And the Ukrainian authorities in the latest years after this anti-constitutional coup d'etat, they prefer meeting for the sake of meetings. They prefer to simulate, to imitate reaching agreements, so they want to have more new contacts, new meetings in front of the TV cameras. Just remember the Minsk agreements that were basically blocked by the Kyiv regime when constantly President Zelensky was saying, so, okay, let's meet, let's talk, let's get together, let's sit down together. And when we reminded to our Ukrainian authorities that we had the Normandy Forum Summit in Paris in 2019, and all the decisions were addressed to Kyiv and none of them were implemented, they started saying once again their appeals to meet once again, to talk once again, and then we will definitely agree on implementing the Paris agreements. But why did we need to meet in Paris if we need another summit to agree on implementing the Paris agreements? So this way of having talks when you replace the reaching an agreement with some external smokes and mirrors. So, look at the Normandy Forum. They wanted to expand it. They wanted to invite Poland. They wanted to invite Turkey, the UK, the US. They wanted to create some parallel contact groups, or they invited French and German to the contact group. A lot of initiatives. So they were blurting out, spurting out one initiative after another, but it has one simple explanation. They want to replace their own actions on implementing their obligations by some other effects. So we have reaffirmed that President Putin does not refuse to meet President Zelensky. I think there will be time when this will become a necessity, but before that, we must make necessary preparations. That is being done in Belarus. So we have made concrete proposals. The Ukrainian side took those proposals and they promised to come up with concrete answers, concrete replies. So we are waiting. We have representatives from the Ukrainian media, the public television of Ukraine, Mr. Lavrov, everywhere where Russia goes with peace and denazification, so they are torturing people, kidnapping people. We know about Crimean Tatars, and we know their statements. And now in south, near the Azov Sea, so a woman was kidnapped. She's the deputy of the regional parliament. So now you are reaching the new heights. So these 8 years, you have not kidnapped people yet. And I want my Turkish colleagues to know what Russia is doing with the Crimean Tatars, not only in Crimea for 8 years. And these are facts. This is my native land. So I lived in Melitopol. You're saying these are facts, but I think that I should rather use another word starting with F, fakes. So there are a lot of fakes on television, online, in all media outlets. I don't know about this story about kidnapping the representative of regional parliament. But I know about the ways that the Kiev regime is famous for. Yesterday I heard that MP Shevchenko disappeared somewhere, and the member of the delegation who participated in the first round of talks, Mr. Kireev, was killed. First, they said because he was a traitor, the security service of Ukraine executed him without any court. And then they said so he got caught into some kind of gunfire. So if we follow these individual stories, we can find a lot of outrageous things. But my assumption is that trying to single out one episode, one individual story that most often has been made up by someone, and now you want to stir up public opinions here in Turkey as well, using this individual fact to pursue anti-Russian policy. Now again, we are replacing a serious conversation, serious talks, serious actions with these kinds of smokes and mirrors. So you can give us any names you like. There are a lot of people here. So I will try to learn more about that, but I have not heard about that. But I heard about Mr. Shevchenko, who disappeared in Zaporozhye and in Kiev. I'm sorry, this is not an interview. That's a press conference. And we would like to give the chance your colleagues to ask their questions. I think, so you have the video of your question, and you will be presented very decently at your home, so you have already reached your objective here. So your Sky News, and we talked about the Italian agency. If you could please give the mic to your colleague. Thank you. So, look, that's democracy for you. Anyone who wants to ask a question just rips the mic out of someone's hands. I have just said that we are very much concerned with the fact that we have found that the Pentagon has deployed dozens of military biological laboratories in Ukraine under their program on building such military biological labs all around the world, in violation of the Convention on Prohibition of Biological Weapons. And we have sent official query on how it can be explained, and we will demand to get a reply. And as for them using these weapons, I don't have information like that. But these were not peaceful experiments. This was not peaceful research. That was an experiment to create biological weapons and ethnically aimed. So I had almost no doubt about that. Izvestia, please. Mr. Lavrov, the U.S., stating openly that they gave a task to their ambassadors to convince the leaders of various countries to join the sanctions. Did you give this task to the ambassadors of our country not to join the sanctions? And this isolation the West is talking about, is it in the heads of the Western officials? As for our ambassadors, in any situation, we are trying to brief them in detail about our positions, about our stance, about the facts regarding various situations that the foreign ministry has to do anything with. And our ambassadors are presenting this information to the officials of the country where they are stationed to create objective perspective, and running around the world and trying to convince a sovereign and independent nation from the UN to basically fulfill an order of an older brother. That's not our tradition. We are polite people, as you are well aware of, and what Americans do, they do not even hide it, that they demand from Turkey, from India, from Egypt, from Southeastern Asia countries, and even from China, they demand to join unlawful unilateral American sanctions. So this kind of disrespect to these great countries, to these great civilizations, I couldn't even have imagined that. But you can see Americans can use any tool to bring their Russophobic attitudes to the top. We are not doing anything like that. Sky News, please. There they are, Sky News. That's Italian Sky News, and that's the original one. As for hospitals and maternity wards, I have just said that, but you're not listening. No one is going to show that. No one is going to say on the Western media outlets that 3 days ago on Security Council, we have explained what happened to that particular maternity ward. As for the claims about who is going to do what or not to do, until the very last, we wanted to resolve the issue via diplomatic means. We have proposed the document about our bilateral relations with the U.S. and the draft agreement with NATO regarding all the essential items of the security on the continent for all the European countries, including Ukraine. But we were told that Ukraine belongs to us, and we will define the Ukraine's destiny by ourselves. And a lot of other things were refuted from what we proposed, including the non-deployment of any military threats for the Russian Federation on the ground. And President Putin explained it, why we made this decision about this special military operation. Hopefully, even if you're not allowed to talk about it, to tell your audience about it, you can read more about this by yourself and to understand our logic, because it is explained clearly. We want Ukraine that would be friendly, demilitarized, Ukraine that would not have threat of creating another nationalist state that would have no ban on the Russian language, Russian culture, Russian Orthodox Church, because that has been accumulated for years. And now it is all enshrined in their legislation, and all our appeals, all these 8 years after the coup d'etat, all our appeals to the Western counterparts to try to talk the Ukrainian authorities out of it, so they were just unheeded. And when the law was adopted on the state language in Ukraine that stated that only Ukrainian language was, well, valid for use and all other languages were discriminated against, including teaching these languages in primary school or in the higher educational institutions, not only us, but Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, they started to show their dissatisfaction. But then the Ukrainian authorities made exceptions for the European Union languages from this law. So that was an elegant move. And then only the Russian language was discriminated against, even though in the Ukrainian constitution the rights for the Russian speakers are guaranteed. And then the West calmed down, and that went to show once again that the West wants only one thing from Ukraine: to work against Russia constantly, against all Russian. And you know what the West did regarding the Crimea referendum? You know, that's the double standard of all double standards. When in Kosovo, they had no referendum. But back then, NATO has created a situation with their bombing to make Yugoslavia collapse, to destroy Yugoslavia. And when just some local administration in Kosovo, they declared independence, and almost the entire West, they applauded this and they supported this as the manifestation of democracy and freedom of choice. But why Albanians in Kosovo are allowed to do this and Russians in Ukraine are not? And Albanians, they were encouraged to move towards this goal, because the goal and the old goal of such country as the Britain was not to have in Balkans or in Europe to have states that would be too large. And we are well aware of that. So probably they pursued the same goal in regards of the Russian Federation. But once again, we understand that that's not about Ukraine. That's about aggression against all Russian, about Russian interests, religion, culture, language, security, and many other things. And now the Western reaction towards our actions. So that would be really outrageous. And this kind of reaction shows that that's really an essential struggle for the right of Russia to remain on the world map with the respect to its interests and to its rights. CCTV, please, the floor is yours. Like I said in the beginning, we came here not to replace the talks that are taking place and was started by President of Russia and President of Ukraine. It's taking place in Belarus now, because that's where we discuss all practical matters. That's where we explain what needs to be done to put an end to this crisis, to this demilitarization, denazification, to assuring the neutral status of Ukraine and many other things. That's where we have business-like conversation. And we have warned our counterparts since the very beginning of today's meeting that we are not going to create a parallel track of negotiations like probably Ukrainian side would want to, because of the reasons that I've mentioned, because they always like to replace an actual work on implementation of agreements by creating new formats that would be broadcasted all over the news, and they will imitate this kind of activities that they are actually doing any kind of work in this regard. So that what happened during today's meeting, today's event, and it came as no surprise to me that Mr. Kuleba says that we didn't manage to agree on ceasefire because no one intended to agree on ceasefire. All these proposals and all the steps in these proposals, so the Ukrainian side is well aware of all that. And if the objective of the meeting was to ask these questions, so let's end hostilities, let's have ceasefire, let's build humanitarian corridors, not like Russian side suggests, but like the Ukrainian side wants to. And if all these to be done only to say journalists afterwards that all our good intentions failed, well, I guess then that completely within the logics of the Ukrainian diplomacy that I've just mentioned, just to go for some external effects, just to be perceived by the audience, by the public opinion in a certain way, but they are replacing actual work by doing that. Well, I think I touched upon this topic, how we are going to get out, because one of your colleagues asked that, and I told that we will resolve this issue, and we will resolve it in such a way that we will never be dependent on our Western partners anymore, be it a state entity or some private company, because they do not care about the interests of their own business. So they have become a tool of the political aggression that is being perpetrated by the West against Russia. And we are going to do it so not to be in the similar situation anymore, so that no Uncle Sam, no other uncles could make no decisions that would be aimed at destroying our economy. We will find ways to be independent of this, and it should have been done a long time ago. And as for what else did you ask about? Sanctions? Well, basically, I'm talking about sanctions now. And as for oil and gas, we just all leave it on the conscience of our Western counterparts because we have never used oil and gas as a weapon. And something they are accusing us of regularly. I think the first crisis was in 2010 when the Ukrainian authorities started stealing gas, the transit gas sent to Europe, because they stopped paying for their own gas. We kept pumping gas to Europe, we fulfilled our obligations in volume and in price, and they were stealing gas. What do you think? Did Europe try to calm them down? No, they were saying that Russia is using this gas as a weapon, even though they were perfectly aware of what was going on in reality. So everything that is happening in regards of Ukraine has only one criteria to follow. How can this country be used to damage the Russian Federation? How this country can be used to contain Russia? And this containment started a long time ago, before they officially announced that. Because in Europe, they are saying it's also an interesting thing that characterizes the current European values. So they're using all kinds of obscenities, so they are imposing sanctions. They banned their companies from staying there. Everyone is leaving, everyone is running away. And at the same time, they're saying, we will continue buying oil and gas because otherwise we will freeze. Well, if they stop buying oil and gas, our Vice Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, who is in charge of the energy sector of our economy, he gave a detailed answer that we are not going to try to persuade them to ask them to buy our oil and gas. If they want to replace it with something else, well, let them do that, because we are going to find new markets to sell our oil and gas to. An American reporter, from what I understand, so please use your mic if you can. I have already said whether we are going to react anyhow to the actions of the countries that are flooding Ukraine with weapons. We think that these countries are creating huge threat for themselves when they are supplying very dangerous weapons like mobile air defense complexes, and when they just look on idly when the Ukrainian authorities are giving away rifles and guns to anyone who wants to without any ID verification. We have never said that we had any plans in regard of the NATO states. Only my new counterpart, Liz Truss, said something along these lines. She stated that something like, if Putin is not lose in Ukraine, then his ambitions will have no border, and his new goals will be the Baltic states and Moldova. We are not the ones who are saying that. Liz Truss is saying that, and she's famous for statements like that. But now when she anticipates the attack against the Baltic states and Poland, I think, well, it's worthy of English culture and English politics, English diplomacy, because that's exactly how Englishmen compiled the so-called fake will of Peter the Great. So they've been doing it for some time now. Good afternoon, Andrei Kolesnikov, Kherson Daily, Mr. Sergei Lavrov. We can see now things that were impossible to imagine even yesterday. Do you believe that the nuclear war could break out? I don't want to believe that. I do not believe that. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this topic of nuclear weapons in the context of what has been happening in Ukraine in recent year and the exacerbation of the situation in latest weeks and months. So the nuclear topic was added to this discourse only by the Western counterparts, first of all, from the NATO states. Liz Truss again. So we talk a lot about her today. So she stated that she does not exclude the conflict between NATO and Russia, and which is something unimaginable. And Mr. Stoltenberg, and I think he has become too independent in his action. He doesn't even run his statements by all the members of NATO as he should. So he said that if NATO wanted, then they would deploy nuclear weapons in the Eastern European alliance members. Mr. Le Drian, my French counterpart, said that Putin should remember that France, too, has nuclear weapons. An economy minister of France proudly said that the West declares total war on Russia. Total Krieg, like French used to say back in the day. And President Biden also referred to that example when he was asked, was there any alternative to those sanctions from hell? He said, the only alternative is World War III. So it is on their subconscious. So they keep on remembering that, keep on reminding about that. We have never mentioned that, but of course, well, it is of concern when the Western officials are coming back to these kind of statements all the time. So now the final question, please. President of Kazakhstan, Mr. Tokayev, suggested Kazakhstan as a platform to have talks between Russia and Ukraine. Does Russia consider this proposal, and when could there be a new round of talks between warring parties? Well, like I said in the beginning of this press conference, Russia is grateful to everyone who, out of good intentions, offers their services in brokering this difficult external conflict, inner conflict of Ukraine. And we are grateful to all those who is ready to facilitate looking for the solution and keeping in mind all the concerns of everyone and keeping in mind the equity of interest like we suggest to. But the main thing, the essential thing is all these proposals, and we are convinced that our Turkish friends and Kazakhstan friends are have only good intentions in mind when they do that. They shouldn't follow the footsteps of the Ukrainian side, who just want some external effects instead of actual actions, because they suggested to move the contact group to Kazakhstan when the Minsk agreements were still almost alive, and they suggested to use Turkey as platform for these talks. And behind all that, they just wanted to refrain from implementing their obligations that they agreed upon and to replace it with all these external effects. But if there is added value, like President Putin said, we are going to consider all kinds of formats that should not be convened just for idle talks. And the latest, very final question. Yes, we are quite serious. Well, you see, for the third time, I'm getting this question about the maternity ward, and for the third time, they do not want to listen to my answer. And I think you're not even listening to my answer if you don't speak Russian. So now you're wearing the headgear. I said that for the third time I'm getting this question about the maternity ward, which means that you have not heard about this particular case that I've described already. And your corporation and all other Western media are now putting this into their headlines because this maternity ward, and we talked about this on March 7th, it had no women, no children, no medical professionals inside. It was occupied by the militants of the Azov battalion with other radicals, and they turned it into their block post, like they do all across Ukraine when they turn civilians into human shields, when they turn residential areas into human shields as well, when they deploy the strike weapons there, and when they strike the positions of the Russian forces, of the Donetsk and Lugansk forces. And as for our proposals, so they were absolutely serious. And we made these proposals known back on December 15th about creating the security system. And it wasn't anything new, so we weren't talking about any new system, but we were only talking about implementing something that had been agreed upon at the highest level, including the OSCE summit in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010. And it said very clearly, yes, every country has the right to choose alliances, but no one has the right to enhance one's security at the expense of the security of the others. That formula was agreed upon, was endorsed. So that was the peak of diplomacy. This was the decision signed by the leaders of Russia, of our neighboring states, and I'm sorry, by the leaders of the free world, let me put it this way. No one is going to enhance one's security at the expense of security of the others. And no organization, no country, no group of countries, no one in the European space has the right to dominate this space. Like it's happening now with NATO, when they blatantly violate all their obligations. And when, in reply to our proposal to have an agreement between Russia and NATO that would enshrine the principle that didn't appear from the thin air, but that was enshrined in the document signed at the highest level. So to ratify them, to make them legally binding, so instead of replying from each state, we only get the small note from Mr. Stoltenberg and Mr. Borrell. So just a half a page where they said, so please don't worry, we're ready to talk. And that was it. And the fact that these obligations were signed Obligations we want to see implemented not by NATO, not by European Union, but individual states sign those obligations. It means that the UK and the other leaders of the West, they just delegated this right to the Secretary General of NATO, all their authorities, and he was put in charge for implementation or non-implementation, those promises that are enshrined in the OSCE summit documents. So that's what your representatives turned diplomacy into, Western representatives. Yes, we want diplomacy now. We want diplomacy to resolve all the matters. But this time, we have clearly explained that demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine are needed, and we can delay no more, because the threat that has been created in this territory, the threat for the Russian Federation, direct threat, military threat, cultural threat, informational threat, language threat, civilization threat, if you will, that has become apparent, that has emerged. So yes, if we talk to decent people, if we talk in honest way, if that what was happening, I think everything would have been resolved long time ago, and the agreements on the mutual security would have been reached. But we do not see partners who are ready to speak to us in an honest manner. Even though there were such attempts, and I hope that those Western leaders who became so excited now about what's happening in Ukraine, when they saw this existential threat for the entire security caused by their unwillingness to fulfill their obligations, we have never wanted war, and we still don't want war. We want this war to be over, because it is also in the interests of the two republics who decided against accepting this bloody anti-constitutional coup d'etat in 2014, who decided against this regime, who were smirking when they looked at how their followers were burning people alive in Odessa, when they sent military planes to bomb the center of Lugansk. And all these 7 years, they were bombing and shelling residential areas and villages and schools and nurseries. And there are a lot of proofs of that. There's a lot of evidence, because our journalists, and I would like to thank them, and I would like to bow my hat to those who went there and to show that 24/7, they can show you everything that was happening there. And the Western journalists, all these 7 years, they hardly ever went to the contact line. And they didn't show how the other side lived, because the destruction was 70%, 80%. They were concentrated on the militia side, which is a proof of who started shelling. Once the representative of your corporation, of BBC, for a couple of days they went there, and actually they made quite an unbiased report from there, story from there. But to continuously cover this topic of sabotaging the Minsk agreements, about this aggression, about the UN security, about the statements on unwillingness to implement this vital document. I don't remember anyone in the West covering this topic. And if you look at what you're talking and writing about what's happening in Ukraine now, and if you compare to what you were telling all these 8 years, I think we are going to have a very interesting picture about the freedom of speech, about the freedom of information access, and a lot of other things that are also enshrined at the decisions made at the highest level under the OSCE. And that is not quite respected by our Western counterparts. So, dear colleagues, thank you so much. So, we are concluding the press conference. Thank you.